This is symbols too, and all I have to say is, that is, which can be developed to, sound is a mystery. Sound interiorizes. It's the spoken quality of language that sinks in. It's the emotional, magnetic quality around sound that allows for words to sink in and have meaning. Feeling is the substrate of meaning. Thought grows out of feeling. But when thought grows out of feeling, it follows the template that feeling has established, so that intelligence begins in feeling and not in thought. Thinking as a function, as a symbolic function, is powerful because it's based upon already the intelligence of feeling, which is myth. And myth, as we have seen, is experience. Our experience, which occurs and happens in a sequence that makes sense. If experience doesn't occur in a sequence that makes sense and cannot be said, if it's a story that cannot be told, it doesn't register as experience. It registers, but it registers in a random, sensate fashion, like a buckshot pattern that's way off target. When we try to find some way to bag this understanding, to net this tremendously potent insight, when men and women for the last 5,000 years have struggled to try to find with what tool could we hold on to this insight. We don't want to destroy its wings. We would like to catch it, but catch it in such a way that we can look at it, not only to inspect it, but to appreciate it. And generally, in the history of this planet, men and women have utilized a tripartite way of speaking about this particular insight. The insight is, how does language become thought? Why is there such a phenomenon as the mind? Why would the mind occur? And further, why would the mind be objective? Why is the mind objective? Objective to the extent that one could make a clear pairedness between body and mind. I'm not speaking now of philosophic duality, but on standard of objectivity. The mind is as objective as the body. Symbolic objectivity is on a par with ritual objectivity. And as we've seen in our education, ritual comportment, the actions of ritual comportment establish existence. What is ritual good for? It establishes existence, which registers as the body. One can even metaphorically say the body of work of an artist. is the stuff that was made, the body of our existence. The stuff of the mind is just as objective. And so when you're talking about what's real, one has to have at least the calipers of ritual and symbol together on standard of objectivity in order to establish, in all fairness, what is real in terms of objectivity. But look here. We saw immediately in our education that nature refuses to be objective. Every time some objectivity is attempted to be pinned onto nature, it dances away. It eludes those attempts. And we saw that nature is better characterized, rather than as some static objectivity, as a fluid changeability. And so protean is this fluid changeability of nature that we could use the very convenient word of mystery, that nature is a mystery. It's a process of mystery. Nature is a mysterious process. And just as we saw that ritual comportment establishes an objectivity that's paired with the objectivity of the symbolic mind, nature has a pair in its process, in its changeability. And the pair to nature is language, the realm of myth. The mythic horizon is not objective, but also is a changeable process that has great affinity to the mystery of nature. But it's exactly at this point, at this juncture, in terms of this regard, using a French kind of an English, it's in terms of this regard that language is a mysterious process, just as nature is a mysterious process. It's exactly at this point that we need to be aware of a tendency to misstate, to misrepresent. The misstatement, the misrepresentation, is that somehow words are equivalent to things in nature. The whole foundation of what we would call representation is that something represents something else. Especially, par excellence, a word represents a thing which it's equivalent to, and this is not the case at all. It is the case in a retrojective imposition, but that is a special conditional. It's not at all true. Language tends to be representational because of this retrospective quality. But when one looks phenomenologically at it, when you look with a very clear quality of perception, words in no way are things. Language in no way is a static collection, a diagram of objectivity. Language is always, in every case, in terms of itself, a fluidity, a process, a changeable ocean. And so our two examples here, to begin with symbols, Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse, William Faulkner, As I Lay Dying, both are novels, symbolic novels, that use a stream of consciousness writing, that use the English language in a stream of consciousness way. And had we time, the greatest of all stream of consciousness writers was Marcel Proust. And there are times when one has to get a taste of the best. And if you can, go to Proust, dip into À la recherche de temps perdu, any place, and try to read a few pages, and right away you'll get it. That something extremely mysterious is happening in language, Not that language is representing something mysterious elsewhere, but in the very use of it. The very fluid flow of language itself is mysterious, as is nature, so that the pairedness between languages and nature is not a pairedness of representation, but is a pairedness of affinity. Using the chemical term, affinity. So that words have an accumulative, an associative expansion, not on the basis of static representation and its subheadings, but on the very different basis of affinity. So that when you're listing associations, when you're going into the associative development of words, it's a misrepresentation, it's a misunderstanding to look for the little static sub-entries under representation. We're not looking for that sort of thing here. We're looking more for a quality of resonance rather than a quality of representation. But this particular issue is not crucial in myth. It becomes crucial in symbols. Because to carry over the representational misstatement into the symbolic realm, to carry over the misunderstanding of the nature of language, to think that language is somehow representational of reality, makes then the mind an imitator of the real, because it masters the representation. It makes of the mind then a mime genius, which it is not. Well, that is to say, yes, there are many minds which are great mimics, but as the Zen saying goes, they are monkey minds. Monkey see, monkey do. And one of the qualities, staying with the metaphor for just a moment, of the monkey mind is that it is unable to be still. It is unable to meditate. It is unable to contemplate. It is unable, in the most fundamentally simple way, to be itself. Because it is always busy. You have to put this in quotation marks, in italics, and in blue neon. It's always busy being something else, being some representation rather than being present. And a mind which is not present is not able to function symbolically at all. It bends, it misshapes, it cripples, it maims. All in the name of trying to keep up with what it's supposed to do, what it's supposed to represent. Now, one can make a tremendous case that the whole basis of totalitarian politics is here in this nutshell. And as I used to talk with this kind of language in the 60s, that it's here where we either tie the bow of meaning or we cinch the knot of dogma. It's here that you learn to have ideas or that you become convinced of an ideology. It's exactly at this point. And so it's very important not to rush it. We're in no hurry at all. We have months. We have months to consider this. We have largesse, we have plenty of space, plenty of time, and something, a third level, space, time, and motion. We talked right at the beginning of today how men and women over the last 5,000 years have found that the best net for bringing in this most delicate point is a three-part, a tripartite, a three-level quality of apperception. In the West, it's called motion, space, and time. Three elements that go up to make what we call the real. In India, in Sanskrit, those three were called rajas, tamas, and sattva. And if you need some kind of equivalent there, the rajas is motion, the tamas is space, and the sattva is time. And the only reason of bringing up the Sanskrit at this point is that it's in Sanskrit poetics some 1,100 years ago that the most accurate, poignant characterization of what symbols are was made. In the 800s, in the 9th century in India, at a time when Indian thought was as ripe as it ever would get. In the 800s, Indian thought was as full and mature, as varied, as complex as it ever would be. It was a great harvest. It's the era of Padmasambhava, who went to Tibet and founded the Vajrayana. It's the era of the Bodhikaryavatara by Shantideva, the great Mahayana Buddhist classic. It's the era when the whole yogic development around Tilopa began, the tradition that eventually included people like Milarepa centuries down the line. It was the culmination of the great Gupta age in India. It was the last time that Buddhism was philosophically viable in India, along with Hinduism and all the other qualities. In that age, there were writers who understood language to the nth degree. And part of their understanding to the nth degree was that they had about 600 years of superior logic to build upon. That Indian logic, Sanskrit logic from the 2nd century on, had refined itself to a point to where it was just colossally learned. One had, especially in India, from the 2nd century on, for the very first time in human history, a specifically clear idea of zero. The whole development of zero comes in India. The focus of the ability to say specifically what is not on the most archetypal level, what is fundamentally zero. And out of this, after 600 years, came a development of the sense of symbol. Then in the 9th century was finally put down, and the great classic of symbolism at that time is called the Devani Loka. Devani means meaning. It means the symbol as the presence of meaning, but it also brings in the focus of the three qualities of motion, space, and time. And what is significant here, space and time, as we know from relativity physics in the 20th century, are intimately the same fabric. Space and time, intimately the same fabric. What's different here is motion. And motion has a peculiarity to it. It has, because in the nature of the way things are, it has a polarity. It has a bifurcation. It has a pairedness, which is there in its structure. And the pairedness in motion is the pairedness between dynamic and energy. going back just for a second, the ancient Greek had two words: dynamis and energeia. Energy is like an intensity, dynamis is like a force. If you're going to talk about the force of physics, you would talk about dynamics. So that in a physics text, for instance, you would have a chapter on hydrodynamics, thermodynamics. And so when you talk about dynamics, about motion as dynamics, you're talking about force. But when you're talking about motion as energy, one talks not about physics so much, but about music. Energy is like an intensity. It's an emotional intensity. It's a feeling-toned intensity that's there. But not there statically, but there fluidly in the process of motionality, if I can use that term. So that when you bring together physics and music, when you bring together space and time and motion in its dynamic and energetic qualities, and you focus these, when they are focused, they create together reality as we know it. And that reality occurs in a paired way. It occurs in existence as the atomic and molecular structure of what we glibly call things, but it also occurs in the resonant and consonant ways in which the mind's objectivities focus. In Sanskrit, it's called chitta. It's called an instant of thought, an atom of thought. I guess now we should revise it. A quark of thought. A chitta. You've heard of bodhicitta, the thought of enlightenment. The split second, the nanosecond, the picosecond intuition that there is such a thing as enlightenment. That bodhicitta, that there is such a thing as enlightenment, that's the seed of an idea. And that seed of an idea is the objective, the quark-like objectivity of the mind. And it holds reality on a par with the objectivity of the stuff. That atomic and molecular structure and mental structure hold on a par together. Not only do they hold on a par together, but they establish a consonance so that when the two are consonant together, what then is real all the way through nature. It's real in interstellar space, and it's real in the imagination, it's real in the ideas. And one of the curious freedoms of the spirit is that it can participate in this entire spectrum at the same time. One of the greatest documents of the Renaissance was Pico della Mirandola's great essay on the dignity of man. And his conclusion, the greatest document, single document of the Renaissance, his conclusion on the dignity of man is that man is the only place in the universe where the entire spectrum, the entire measurement of the real is available to him. The angels cannot record certain levels of existence. The demons cannot record, but man is able to go up and down the core of all the universe and record everywhere. Man participates everywhere on the entire measurement of the real. And the dignity of man is that he is the messenger of God, not the angels, not the demons, but man is the messenger of God because he can deliver the letter anywhere, on any level. And the recovery of the dignity of man is the recovery of the equanimity between the body and mind, between ritual and symbol, on the basis of a pair which is so close that together they establish a tuning fork. And when man is together, when a man or a woman is together, they are the carriers of the tuning fork of the real. The symbol of it was the caduceus of Hermes in ancient times, in the Hermetic tradition. If one looks at the caduceus of Hermes, it's like a tuning fork. Able to focus, able to tune body and mind together, so that when they are tuned together, they evoke by their intunement, they evoke a third quality, a third objectivity. What is that third objectivity? The third objectivity is the person. The spiritual person, the actual person, becomes manifest as an objectivity, becomes as real as the stuff, as real as the thoughts. The person comes into objectivity. But to bring the person into objectivity is an exercise of evocative tuning of nature to its best pitch. And our education here is all about doing this sort of thing, but we're doing it slow motion because it's very complex. If we try to go any faster than we're going right away, we get into more issues than we could handle easily. In 1 minute, we could become so confused it would take a year to unravel it, if one could. But by pacing ourselves and by going through a phase form process with a lot of time to do it, time to get used to it, to get sensitized to it, so that the phases are presented, not represented by some powerful idea, but presented as themselves. We sweep through this phase form energy cycle in such a way that it recalibrates who and what we are in terms that are familiar. And it's this time of recalibration that takes the 2 years of our education. It's like a tuner who comes in for a superior musical instrument. He has to tune each thing. A piano tuner must tune each of the 88 keys, each of the 88 wires, each one. You can't just turn one master tune and then have the whole thing. Each element has to be tuned. And this education requires that duration, that learning duration, that sensitizing duration. And it's not a matter of understanding some powerful ideas. The powerful ideas are themselves only one phase out of 8 of this entire education. The only place that powerful ideas come into play is in symbols. The only place where really powerful ideas are useful is in understanding the mind and its place in the ecology of nature. In all the other realms, there are other aspects that are more important. Each phase has its own aspect, and the person is the most important aspect of art, because we will see next year, about the middle of next year, we will see that art has an objectivity which is as archetypal as the body or the mind. The work of art establishes in a very curious, mysterious way, not only the artist, but the appreciator. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony makes Beethoven's person cosmic scale. But someone who can appreciate that Ninth Symphony, who hears that, who appreciates that, also establishes their person on that level. They become, in themselves, in their own persons, Beethoven-esque, which adds a dimension and a quality to their possibility. And we'll see how ritual, symbol, and art together as a three-part, a tripartite quality of objectivity, has an alignment. It's like an old Paleolithic wisdom that if you put basic structures of reality in alignment, that alignment in itself sets up an attunement. In Paleolithic times, the alignment of stones in a landscape of soil was a way of bringing out the sound of the land. A ley line follows the magnetic lines of the earth because the magnetic lines of the earth carry the sound of the planet. And some old Paleolithic magus architect who knew what he was doing would set up a ring of stones somewhere to be the condenser, to be the sound board, and then carry that as a ley line across the landscape, sometimes for hundreds of miles, making sure to keep the alignments and anchor it at the other end, perhaps in another circle, perhaps in some other kind of a shape. And when that's established, the ambient magnetic energy of the planet sounds along that ley line so that someone who was attuned to the landscape could feel it, could get that note. And by establishing a pattern of such notes, Paleolithic men and women learned the song of the earth, learned how to be real in the largest terms they knew, in terms of the world that they were in terms of the planet that they lived on and inhabited. And they became wise. They became as wise as the context would allow. They filled it completely. And that's why they were able to transform. Because as soon as one level of existence is filled, it's ripe then to be transformed to the next level. And the Paleolithic went into the Neolithic. And when that was filled, it went into the symbolic. And as that is filled now, it's ready to go someplace else, someplace it has never been. And men and women are poised, almost like with invisible wings, ready to establish ley lines that go between planets and stars. Who knows what kinds of sounds there would be? But look here. The easiest misunderstanding and misrepresentation of this would be to crunch this entire visionary possibility with some kind of statement like, well, in space there's no sound, so how could there be any sound at all? Do you see the squelching quality of that? I mean, it's only post-Voyager that one knows from JPL up here in Pasadena that planets with their magnetic fields moving in the solar wind create sound, create a tone. That every planet in its orbital has a special sound. And NASA, courtesy of Voyager, recorded the sound of every planet in our star system. They issued little whistles of the sound of the Earth. The sound of our planet in its orbit around its star had a little tinny toot kind of quality to it, almost like a little child. Almost like when you sounded the bow shock of the Earth in terms of the interstellar solar wind environment, you heard a child's tune, appropriate for our stage of nascent development. But there is such a thing as the consonants of all the planets of this star system. Now that we know that Pluto is an example of the Kuiper belt of asteroids, we know there are 8 major planets. And the 8 major planets together form an octave a musical sound octave of the star system. There is such a thing as the Pythagorean music of the spheres. Gustav Holst's mystical setting of the planets to music was on the right track. And they'll become a 21st century musician who will write that symphony of the star system by the octave of the actual planets. Taking a cue like Alan Hovhaness took a cue from the songs of the humpback whales and wrote a symphonic piece. Taking the very sounds of the humpback whales and making it a part of a musical expression of a larger humanity. And that's the music section that began our course. If you check with page 39 of our outline of the course, you'll see that the very first music selection in the education is Hovhaness's "And God Created Great Whales." And you'll notice now that the symbols music section, the selection is Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, and how the each interval has its own music selection. And just as the symbols music is Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, the symbol interval is Sibelius's great tone poem, The Swan of Tuonela. Tuonela is the Finnish hell, underworld, netherworld. And what is transformative, even about the underworld, the netherworld, the hell, in Finnish mythology, is that even there, in Tuonela, there is a graceful swan who is not overcome by those conditions, but who floats majestically there. And if one could only find a harmony, an affinity, a resonance with the swan of Tuonela, one could float gracefully even in the midst of the netherworld. A kind of an ultimate guarantee of a salvation. And so one has this quality. All of us have this quality, the quality that Sibelius had. For it was Sibelius who, in his deep silences of the landscape of Finland, heard the sound of the land. And when he heard the sound of the land, it gave him a symbolic consonance with which to see, with which to understand, with which to transform the mythology of Finland. And one of the glories of Finnish mythology is that its great mythological epic, the Kalevala, is written in the early 19th century. It's a mythology that's put together in the early 19th century. And Sibelius's insight into this is like the way in which a symbolic composer, once he experiences the landscape and its motifs are not representations of something else, but presentations of themselves, can make a living focus. A work of music, like Sibelius's tone poem, is not an imitation of something else. He didn't hear something else but write this. He wrote this, and this is what we hear. We're going to take a break and we'll come back. Let's come back, bring ourselves back into focus, and let's have a quotation. This is quite an interesting translation of the symbol structure of Sanskrit poetics. It's made by a Jesuit in Vienna. One would think that Jesuits would be the last people to understand the charm of poetry, and yet in a place like Vienna, miracles happen. Here's a quotation. This is of interest to us. The traditional yoga psychology presumes a sort of universal form to all our thoughts. This a priori structure is imposed on all the contents presented to it. This is the universal knowing aspect of consciousness, called traditionally sattva. Someone who is wise about such a knowing would be a bodhisattva. Someone who's tremendously learned about such a knowing would be called a mahasattva. Let's go back and hear it a second time and carry it forward just a little further, because there's a point here that we need to appreciate. It's the point at which we either maim meaning or allow it to grow. We have to understand that what we're dealing with here seems so ordinary, almost inconspicuous as the stem. But it is out of this very stem that comes the flower. This charis bignonia blossoms through this stem. And that process is extremely mysterious, because this flower is like a word which blossoms through this ritual comportment, this existence. And the importance of the ritual stem is that it focuses the dynamic and the energy together. But when the flower comes out, it has its dynamis as its base, but it has its energeia as its petals. And that's the flower. And words are like that. Let's come back. Recapitulation, and then in the recapitulation, carrying a little bit further. The traditional yoga psychology presumes a sort of universal form to all our thoughts. This a priori form is the structure that is imposed on all contents presented to it. This is the universal knowing aspect of consciousness, sattva, which provides the substratum. The content of ideas is simply the limitation of this universal aspect of sattva. It was a very powerful statement. It's almost like you have to turn the preconception that we usually have inside out. Content is a delimiting of structure. Content doesn't fill structure, it delimits structure. And if one enlarges the content, the delimitation is able to expand. And if one has a transformational content, then the content expands itself to fill the entire structure, and they become one. In Sanskrit, in the whole vocabulary of Sanskrit language, there's a single word that does this. The word that transforms its content to fill the entire structure available, that word is Om. And however much content you want to feed Om, that content will distribute itself fully through the structure of the language. Now here's an extremely powerful point. Now we gear it into our education. Words must convey feeling before symbolization takes place. Words have to have feeling, otherwise they don't symbolize. Symbols have a feeling substrate. Whereas the representational skewed misunderstanding is that symbols are abstract and they specifically don't have feeling. And that for you to learn symbols means that you have to divest yourself of feeling. You've got to get real abstract, otherwise you're not going to understand. Whereas that misadvice cripples and maims your ability to symbolize as well as your ability to feel. There isn't a poet, man or woman, in the whole history of the literatures of this planet who didn't understand the intimate relationship between feeling and symbol. That's the whole point of poetry. That the symbols blossom out of the feeling. The feeling and the symbolization are all a part of the same motion, the same structure. And the motion has a paired quality, has a dynamic quality, so it has force, it has oomph. But it has an energy quality also, so it has intensity. The force registers in motion as momentum. The energy registers in space-time as sound. So that if one were trained for 25, 35, 45 years in traditional yogic wisdom, one could learn to hear not just the forest in its sounds of birds and animals and wind and so forth, but one could hear the sound of the planet. One could hum it. Could hum that. And that hum, that basic substrate sound of the reality of the planet is like the drone that one hears in the chant. If you've ever heard a Upanishad chanted, it's like a Scottish bagpipe that not only has its melodic line, but has a drone substrate that carries the dynamics so that the energy that goes into the melody is carried along by the rhythm. And so music not only has a melodic line, it has its rhythm. And as soon as one puts a rhythm, the rhythm transforms noise into the possibility of music. As soon as one has the beat, there's a possibility then that the melodic line can rise out of that beat. And having its reality on the substrate of that rhythm, weave its magic, create its charm. And the charm is that it evokes a reciprocity out of the universe. The universe is just so bountiful, so chock full of possibility, that whenever some kind of charming present is made apparent, the universe responds, it reciprocates. And when one makes present this deep rhythm and the melodic line, out comes the evocation of music. It can be on level of a Beethoven walking in the Vienna woods and listening to the birds and suddenly hearing that the birds are singing songs, that the bird chirping is not just random chirps, but create a melodic line, and that the bird songs then can be transposed into like the Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony. Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, like Hovhannis's And God Created Great Whales, takes a natural sound, hears the structure of it and the content together as a song, and that is able to be put into a personal musical composition. So that when someone who has musical ear on level of Richard Wagner hears Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, his Pastoral Symphony, musical genius like Richard Wagner hears exactly what the bird song was underneath the melodic line of Beethoven, and Wagner gets idea of musical motifs and starts to write whole catalog for himself of musical motifs that evoke human feelings, specifically, exactly, and puts them together in musical compositions that astound the world. Nobody's ever heard. One has heard in Haydn or in Mozart or in Beethoven, one has heard melodies and melodic lines, but one has never been confronted by the drama of arranged musical motifs. When one hears prelude to Die Meistersinger, the melodic line is not just simply a beautiful tune, but it evokes feelings of triumphal grandeur, which belong not to the birds, but to a master singer. Someone who knows not only how to sing natural songs or make those natural songs into human expressions, but to create human songs that were never heard in nature before, that express a spiritual, differential quality, which becomes then high art. So that someone like a Wagner at that point is no longer satisfied with music hall. Needs to have, like Bayreuth, a festival, or to present opera cycles on scale of new musical form. All of this happens because language has the ability to interiorize, because words, when they become filled with feeling, they sink deeper into us, and the deeper that they sink into us, the more that feeling space begins to give rise, not just to the presence of feeling, but the presence of feeling flowers into the presence of thought. And ideas diametrically different from the kind of dried out things that most schooling convinces people that they are. Ideas are flowers. Ideas are not abstract, feelingless, geometric forms you have to be a robot to appreciate. Not at all. There are no robots that can appreciate ideas. Ideas are flowers. They're flowers in the mind. The symbol for enlightenment for the Buddha is the lotus. The symbol for enlightenment in the Western tradition is the rose. They chose flowers, not geometries. When one sees someone choosing geometries as the symbol of realization, one understands that they're still on ritual level. They didn't graduate yet. They're still in grade school. And not a matter for criticism. It's just simply a matter for congratulations. Do the 6th grade again. You'll get it, because if you've gone this far, you can get the rest of it. Instead of just telling somebody what you believe, try to sing it to them. And if you can't set it to music, maybe there's something wrong with those words. And there comes a point of mystical inflamement where language flames into a presence which suddenly one realizes that the mind on level of our capacity spreads to the entire realm of existence. Not only existence as delimited by the content of ritual, but existence especially beyond ritual in realm called imagination. The mind can explore imaginative realms equally with physical realms. A powerful symbolism is at home in imaginary realms as it is in physical realms. There are whole branches of mathematics that go into imaginary numbers that were never there physically, but certainly have an objective reality, and one can pluck out of imaginary, irrational explorations of mathematics principles and ratios which can be then brought back consciously and applied, and the physical universe dances to those tunes. So that men and women have learned the magic of consciousness, of being able to call out from the universe responses that were not originally there, something new. Then one understands with Pico della Mirandola that we are extraordinary. And what's extraordinary about us is our creative freedom. And as soon as that's appreciated, one begins to look at another human being in a whole different dimension. This is not just a so-and-so, identified as a so-and-so, delimited by such and such ideas or ideologies. This is a full-fledged stem of reality able to flower into who knows what, if they could be encouraged to do so, if they could be invited to explore. Then one sees what Chaucer saw. He looked upon the world, he didn't see the misery of the time. He lived at the time of the Black Death, of the great plagues. A third of mankind was killed in Europe, the Black Plague. But one doesn't find bitterness in Chaucer. One finds the appreciation for human character. A fair field full of folk. The incredible permutations of human being. It's this field of flowers that humanity, that men and women present to the matured person. But that matured person needs to have first a fulfilled mind, but that fulfilled mind needs the maturity of feeling even before that. And so on level of mythic horizon, where experience has its ecology, has its circulation, the circle of a mythology is not so much a circle, but a cycle. It's like the ancient Greek idea of the river that encircles the world, the oceanos. The ocean is not just a body of water, no matter how large, statically there, but the ocean is a flow of water around the world. And a mythology is this kind of ocean. It's a flow of water around the world, just as nature is a flow of water around the universe. And that wherever they flow, that's included in the pattern of the motion of the process. And as that pattern of motion of that process integrates and brings space and time in with it, focuses occur that are real, that maintain themselves, not so much because they are it, but because they are focuses of these forces. They're overlappings of these resonances, and where they overlap, they weave together really tightly. Tight enough to make their common focus real, what we would call real. This is real. Just as if we were able to look with atomic structural vision. An atom, let's say an atom of hydrogen, most fundamental matter in the universe, atom of hydrogen. If you could look with atomic vision eyes, the nucleus of the hydrogen atom is like a little fly, and the electron shell is about the size of a football stadium. And all what's in between is a kind of a space-time, but it's a space-time that's amenable to the motion of the electron. And the electron can be anywhere in the stadium, anywhere in the shimmering sphere of that stadium, because it has a direct reciprocity and affinity with that proton fly at the center. And all other atomic structures are developments of that. And development which has in its way a very interesting kind of pairedness. The second element that occurs is helium. On atomic structure family, we give hydrogen a 1, and we talk about helium. Helium has this quality of balancing itself with hydrogen. Hydrogen converts into helium very easily. If you take two hydrogen atoms, if you take two flies, two centers of hydrogen, and those two flies dance together, one then begins to have a helium nucleus. In order to keep those two protons together, they need a third level, not a neutralizing, but a reconciling third. The principle in the Hermetic tradition is always between ultimate polarities. If you introduce a reconciling third, you get a transformative structure. You bring the two protons together, the two electrons together, and you resolve that with two neutrons, then a helium nucleus with two protons and two neutrons, and then it has its electron shell. Not a shell so much, but a sphere of energy, a sphere of dynamic illumination. Then one has an atomic structure out of which matter begins to build. All the other elements build out of that. Then if you take a helium atom and a hydrogen atom and you bring them together, you get a lithium atom. If you take a lithium atom and add a hydrogen atom to it, you get a beryllium atom. Or if you take two helium atoms and you bring them together, you get a beryllium atom. Nature begins then to build on this kind of paired reconciliation. But the affinities that are there are affinities where the content is a delimitation of the structural reality. Not that God draws the outlines and then colors it in with content. The structure is given completely, totally. It's the content that makes the stages of manifestation. And so one has to get used to an inside-out view. The key to it, the trigger to that, is to decondition the mind to a representational model and sensitize it to a presentational model. Or not even a presentational model so much, but a presentational focus, presentational occurrence. And the key for us is where language begins to move to an interiorization of meaning. It is meaning here that begins to hold this. The Sanskrit term for a little iota of these word consciousness a priori structural forms. The Sanskrit word was sphota, S-P-H-O-T-A, almost like photon, sphota. Here's how it reads in this introduction. Since consciousness exists in its states, thought or language and consciousness are one and the same. The universal sphotas at this level are the a priori forms of word consciousness. They then manifest themselves through the rajas and tamas. This primordial sphota is unitary in nature, but gets bifurcated in the process of uttered speech and results in, this is a Jesuit writing, a subject-object duality in ordinary cognition. It's not so much a subject-object duality. In 9th century Indian thought, they were way beyond that. They'd already mastered the logic. A three-value logic which incorporates a neutral zero into its one and all, it comes out with much beyond duality, way beyond. Is different from, as if duality were a two-dimensional world and a three-dimensional, three-value logic is like a spherical world. It's completely beyond. So this is a misstatement here on his part. What's important here? The point for us, not to learn Sanskrit poetics, but the point for us is to understand that human beings have understood that as words go into the interiorization, into that imaginative realm, and that space-time motion together of that imaginative realm begins to seethe as a mind, begins to scintillate as a mind. The words get a kind of an energy. They get an intensity. And the deeper they go, the more intensity they have, the more energy they have. And their energy is an energy to burst forth. The dynamis keeps them connected to going in, and the energy, as the other part of it, wants to come out. So that if you have a kind of a language which is very simple, the words don't go very deep before the energy accumulates enough that they spring back out. Those kinds of images belong to a very early primordial level of expression. Children. But as one gets more used to packing, to making words more dense, those words go deeper. They get more energy. So when they come out, bigger flowers. There comes a point where men and women understand that this is what's going on. This is the situation. So they begin using special kinds of words that go deeper and deeper so that when they come out, they have bigger and bigger flowers. Till one has the capacity to make a word like Om, which goes all the way to the center of the mind, so that when it comes out, its flower is the mind as a whole. That's the lotus. That's the rose. When the mind flowers as a whole, it has a property that nature never saw before. What is that property? It has a perfume. It has a fragrance. And consciousness is the fragrance of the real. It's not at all some kind of mechanical, abstract, who could care less. It is the most remarkable perfuming of nature by a bouquet that one has not experienced before. As Pico della Mirandola writes, or even in the Vimalakirti Sutra in Buddhism, similar kind of insight. The demons and angels are astounded that out of transformed human beings, that out of mere men and women, they can go into this kind of chrysalis of the mind and come out butterflies of the spirit. Well, how can they do that? The little demons and the angels both are saying, but how can they do that? Because human beings are not delimited by any kind of ceiling on the content. Our content can go as deep as the structure itself. And so you cannot say that somebody is such and so, and that's all that they are. they're able to intensify. They're able to get a stronger dynamic. They can be taught that human beings are educable. The demons never learn. They're always demons. The angels never learned. One is so used to bowing to angels. In one of the New Testament letters, letter to the Hebrews, written by Apollos of Alexandria, he says at one point in there, he says, when you talk about man being subservient to angels, to what angel did God ever give the kingdom? They have a job to do. That's their place. Even the angel of the presence has his job to do. But man, he's family. He gets the house. He gets the estate. He gets the inheritance. You're my children, not my servants. The demons and the angels are staff. So that men and women have this tremendous secret, which neither demons nor angels are all that interested or all fired ready to encourage. Right? To get out of work. So that man has to discover himself as this peculiar quality that he is so free, so utterly free, that nothing can stop him except his own inability to discover himself. And his inability, or her inability to discover herself or himself, is strictly tied. It's like almost a structural thing. It's tied to the level of content that one is ready to entertain as possible. And if one entertains all of the content, then what will come out is the mind as a total flower. Every time. Not automatically, but reciprocally. And so an education is the most spiritual of all activities. The developing of the capacity to develop further. Once one learns how to learn, then men and women become very wise and very gentle at the same time. Gentle because there's no rush to push anything. You don't want the dynamis to outstrip the energy. You want them to be in balance so that when the stem reaches the center, the total flower will come out. One can get it to the point to where no language, no intermediate language is necessary whatsoever. The famous flower sermon of Siddhartha, where he simply held up a flower one time. And the only person out of 500 to get it was Kasyapa. Kasyapa, who had been enamored with black magic all his life, and especially black magic tied to the Kundalini, knew how to manipulate this deep Kundalini snake energy of the neural system, and had this tremendous, huge encampment of black magicians alongside the Narangara River. And in his travels, one time the young Buddha came upon Kasyapa's camp and just walked in like Sanjuro. And he said, I would like to meditate here tonight. Kasyapa, thinking he had a nice green sucker to add to his coterie, offered him his own personal hut. And as soon as the Buddha started to sit in the hut, all the serpent Kundalini energy of Kasyapa came into play to hypnotize him, to get him going. But the young Siddhartha knew how to focus it all, and so he brought all that energy to complete focus. And what happens at that focus is that the stem turns into a flower. And he short-circuited all the energy in the camp, not just Kasyapa, but all the magicians. And in the morning when he stepped out, they were all seated, arranged, ready to hear. Who the hell is this? And first thing Siddhartha said to Kashyapa, he said, you're no longer Kashyapa. You're now Maha Kashyapa. You're more than you were. Because you're aware now that the limitations that you put on were limitations to yourself. You wanted all the energy to control the whole world when there's much more than the world. Why do you settle for the world? And when he held up the flower in front of 500 monks one time, Kashyapa, the old Kashyapa, was the only one who smiled because he had gotten it some 40 years before. He knew. And so Mahakashyapa, the old monk, was the first one to be able to express without language the ability of language to transform symbols into the mind. Because one can condense language, one can make words that are very powerful so that you can end up with an ultimate word like Om. But there's a capacity in the high Dharma to enfold even the two letters of Om, enfold those so that they disappear in upon themselves. So all that's left is the exclamation mark. And one can convey that exclamation mark. That's all you need. Once one has learned that, that learning is indelible. Why is it indelible? Because it illuminates the structure completely. We're going to come back next week. Try to read a little bit of To the Lighthouse and a little bit of As I Lay Dying. You can try something even as primitive as bibliomancy. Just open either book to wherever you open and read a couple of pages. All right? It doesn't matter where you open it, as long as you read a pair of pages in both. And bring that with you, bring that experience with you next week. And I'll show you some real educational magic. Because I will talk to each one of you in terms of whatever it was that you read. Because whatever it is that you're reading is not just some random thing that's going to be lost, but are locations in patterns that have a consonance. And if somebody knows how to hum the scale and create a melodic line out of that, it's going to integrate whatever it was that you got into. You're going to recognize your notes in that song. That's what Beethoven discovered in the Vienna woods. That's what Hovannes discovered in the Pacific Northwest, listening to the humpback whales. That once you get the vision of the whole, you hear any kind of sound that there is, and the song of that sound comes out and joins your music. That is really freedom. That's maturity. You don't need a degree telling you then that you have that capacity. Someone with that capacity gives others degrees. More next week.